Καλησπέρα σας. Νομίζω ότι είμαστε έτοιμοι να ξεκινήσουμε, οπότε παρακαλώ καθίστε και οι τελευταίοι που ήρθατε. Σας καλωσορίζουμε και στη σημερινή μας ομιλία με έναν εξαιρετικό προσκεκλημένο, τον οποίο θα ξεκινήσω να παρουσιάσω τώρα στα αγγλικά για να καταλαβαίνει και τι λέω για αυτόν. So, we welcome you all to our today's keynote speech by Professor Edmund Sonuga-Barke, which I have the honor to present today. Who is this guy? If I had to summarize Edmund's work, I would probably need to take all of his lecture's time, so I won't, because he will be a little disappointed if I talk instead of him. But I will try to just pick up the most important facts of his career. He is a professor of developmental psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College in London. After 19 years as professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Southampton. He is deputy lead of the Child Mental Health and Neurodevelopmental Disorders theme at the NIHR Maudsley Biomedical Research Center. But that's not all. He is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and the British Academy, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry for I don't know how many years, many, many years. Too many years. And he has also been elected as a member of Academia Europaea in 2023. But all this stuff, I'm not sure if they really tell you who Edmund is. I begin by telling you that he is one of the most highly cited researchers in psychology and psychiatry globally, with an H index of 96. I'm sure most of you can understand what this means. His research has been published in journals such as The Lancet, the American Journal of Psychiatry, and many, many other renowned journals. And he is one of the most well-known psychologists in the world for his research in ADHD, and not only, neurodevelopmental disorders in general. Most of all, he was my PhD supervisor 22 years ago, so I'm really moved and deeply honored to have him here today and make his presentation. And I'm very, very happy to share this experience with you. His research focuses on understanding the origins of neurodevelopmental differences, particularly variations in attention and impulse control, and their impact on mental health. In the field of ADHD, he is known for introducing new concepts and theories, such as the delay aversion hypothesis, the dual pathway model, and the default model interference hypothesis. Together with Professor Sir Michael Rutter, has led the English and Romanian adoptee study, which is a classical one, which discovered how exposure to early childhood severe institutional deprivation can lead to variants of neurodevelopmental conditions such as ADHD and autism that strongly persist into adulthood. Now I'm finishing. But most of all, I would like to say some personal words about him, because he will talk about his research anyway. He's one of the most authentic, passionate, modest, true persons, and highly intelligent I've ever met. And I really think he makes us such a great honor to be with us today. So let's welcome him with an applaud and give him the stage.
Golly, thanks for such a kind introduction. That's wonderful. And it's such an honor to be here to present on such an important meeting in your beautiful city, your beautiful country. And thanks particularly to you, Katerina. And I'm so proud to see how you thrived since you left 22 years ago.
Yes. 2002.
That is very hard to believe, but I mean, it's wonderful what you've achieved, so I'm very proud of that. Okay, so within society at large, ADHD remains a highly contested construct. There's controversies over what it is, if it's anything at all, how we should talk about it, how we should label it, and also how we should treat it, of course. But even within the ADHD community, there's an increasing recognition that the way we are thinking about ADHD now may not be fit for purpose. And this recognition comes out of 30 or 40 successful years of scientific discoveries, which have changed our understanding of the condition we call ADHD, but also cultural changes that have altered the way societies think about people with learning, behavioral or mental health problems. Now, I've tried to, does it work? Oh, great. I've tried to kind of capture the sense of a field in flux by posing you the question. There's a question for you, everybody here. Is it time to flip the ADHD paradigm? I'm not going to give a definitive answer, but hopefully what I will do is set out some of the key issues for you to consider. We could have a vote, actually, couldn't we? I just thought of that. We could, like a debate, we could have a vote. No, but we might do. See if we've got time. But yeah, just set out the key issues, help you to consider the status of ADHD and where we think this whole field is going. I've got to do what is quite hard for me, which is coordinate two hands here. So if I actually press that to move the slides on and press this, I start speaking into this, I apologize in advance. Great. Okay. So we start, when we're thinking about ADHD, as a thing which we would want to treat or would want to research with really a set of behaviors and its impacts. So there are extreme expressions of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that have an impact on a child's functioning, that cause distress, that are associated with negative long-term outcomes. So that's what we're really dealing with. And of course, we could look at that set of behaviors and consequences in loads of different ways. But of course, the way we do look at it is as a psychiatric or a neurodevelopmental disorder. And this is this concept of a medical disorder is at the core of this first part of my talk. So as a medical disorder, it has a long history, of course. Many of you will be aware of this history. And it starts, at least in a sort of formalized way, probably with this gentleman called George Still. And I have to say, it's a great name for somebody who's studying hyperactivity. He had a good sense of humor, but he called it a disorder of moral control. And that's quite Victorian type language, but when you look at the presentation he was describing, it's basically ADHD. We moved on in the field in terms of defining this constellation, impulsivity, inattention, overactivity, to the notion of hyperkinesis. And this focus very much on the behavioral or the activity-related aspects of the condition. With the emergence of the cognitive revolution, and one very influential researcher called Virginia Douglas, it moved to focus on more the cognitive aspects of the condition, from the activity, the behavioral aspects. And so then we started to see things that look a little bit like ADHD. And this was, of course, finally kind of formalized in the famous DSM-3R, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. More recently, in the reformalizations that we've had over the years, DSM-4, DSM-5, what we've seen is a kind of validation of that DSM-3R diagnostic criteria, but with slight modifications. A big change in DSM-5, of course, that people are familiar with, was the first time was a specific adult ADHD with slightly different diagnostic criteria. So there's kind of minor changes in a period of, my golly, yeah, quite a long time. So getting up for 40 years or more than 40 years. So stability in the diagnostic criteria. And I think that's actually been incredibly valuable for the field. So I think the medical model is definitely a double-edged sword for people with ADHD. I do think it's provided a stable set of, stable framework for science. And I do think it's increased access to treatment, and in particular medication, which has had great benefits for people with ADHD. However, we'll now talk about, as we go through today, we'll talk about some of the negative, perhaps the less positive aspects of the medical model and review some alternatives. So it's not just, of course, about these core symptoms. These are just some examples of the wording of the core symptoms in the DSM-5. We have 9 inattention symptoms. We have 6 hyperactivity and 3 impulsivity symptoms, as many of you will know. You also, of course, it's not as simple as adding up the symptoms and saying, yeah, you've got ADHD. There are also loads of other, or quite a few other criteria. Obviously, it's got to be associated with impaired functioning. That's essential to the criteria. It's got to be presented pervasively. So it's not just affecting, it's not just being manifest in one situation. I guess the idea being that it's a character of the individual rather than the context. That's kind of fundamental to the diagnosis. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, sorry, I know I'd do that. And of course, the early onset. Again, this notion that it's something constitutional, something neurodevelopmental that has a relatively early onset. It used to be 7, and now 12 is the onset. But those are additional criteria. So actually the diagnosis, it's very relevant for later on, is really quite a complex clinical decision space. It's not just about how many symptoms, you shouldn't be just about how many symptoms you've got. Prevalence about 5%, although of course, as we know, different countries have very high, a great variability in terms of administrative prevalence. Actually, how many people actually get the diagnosis varies a lot from country to country. But in addition to this diagnostic framework, I've argued over the years that the medical model provides a scientific paradigm for our research, for good or for ill. And what do we mean by a paradigm? So we introduced this gentleman. Many of you will know this chap. I always call him the other philosopher of science people know, over Karl Popper. So this is Thomas Kuhn, and he introduced the concept of the paradigm in understanding scientific progress. And he argued that for science to progress, you need to have a stable set of assumptions about the nature of the thing that you're working on. And these assumptions aren't tested empirically. They just provide the context to shape the questions and your hypotheses as you go forward. So he argued that this was essential. Now, why they're essential is because they provide a common points of linguistic reference for all the different communities that need to work with this construct. So scientists can communicate with scientists using the same basic understandings. And in the clinical or the practical sciences, scientists can communicate with practitioners or clinicians. And then practitioners and scientists can communicate with patients or parents. So this common set of linguistic points of reference are crucial for us to communicate. Science is partly about communication. But crucially, in terms of the downside of paradigms, is they constrain the theories that we can develop and the research questions that we can ask. And in my mind, there's no doubt that the medical model has constrained the research that we've done. And I'll try and give you a bit more about how that might happen. Oh. So, of course, Kuhn argued, he introduced the concept of paradigm shift. And he argued that science progresses through periods of sort of what he called normal science, where there's a kind of chugging along within the paradigm, everything's sort of fine. And then all of a sudden there's a period of crisis where the paradigm gets challenged because it no longer conforms to the data that's coming out of the laboratory. So that's a fundamental crisis, and it causes a paradigm shift. So you go from one paradigm to a more advanced, I mean, it definitely was a progressive notion of science, a more advanced paradigm. So when should a paradigm shift in translational science? Not many people have thought about this, funnily enough, because they think of science in terms of the natural sciences. But I think it's slightly more interesting and complicated with translational science like ours, clinical sciences. The first one is really questioning the therapeutic impact of the paradigm. Has it led to therapeutic innovation in the field or not? If it's not led to therapeutic innovation, then you can start to think, is it fit for purpose in translational science? The second one is really about the sort of scientific credibility of the theory. And this is more like the core notion that Kuhn came up with. And that is that, is the data coming out of the lab actually consistent with the assumptions of the paradigm? And if they're not, then again, you might start to question whether the paradigm is fit for purpose. And then the final and very interesting one, and it definitely impacts the practical sciences and the clinical sciences and the translational sciences, is, in a sense, whether the paradigm is in tune, if you like, with broader societal notions or values about how to talk about patients, for instance, or how to think about conditions. And again, you can think maybe the medical model has run its course when we think about that now as well. So I kind of identified these three reasons why you might want to change your paradigm. So, sorry, I got to do that. So what about ADHD therapeutics? So what about the first criteria? Well, we know that not much has changed in the last 40 years in terms of ADHD therapeutics. So that's not a great advert for the paradigm, if you think about it. Very little's changed. It's still primarily based on psychostimulant or, in some cases, non-stimulant medication as a short-term, I suppose, pragmatic approach to controlling symptoms. We know it's efficacious. I mean, there are hundreds of randomized controlled trials, more or less biased or unbiased. But overall, I think it's clearly one of the most effective psychiatric, inverted commas, drugs that there is out there. But there are limitations. First of all, control is rarely complete. The effect sizes, we're really talking about move towards the norm, and we're not talking about normalization. Whether or not we want to achieve that, that's a different question. There are kind of areas of impairment that aren't improved with medication. So I did a lot of research on academic achievement and Concerta, which is one of the methylphenidate long-release drugs, and we found actually very little effect on academic achievement, which is kind of strange. We expected it to show a big improvement, very little. So that's another, and there are other areas that are the same. That's a very interesting point, because obviously we don't want to treat the ADHD, we want to treat the whole constellation of clinical needs. Long-term benefits are very uncertain. And while in the past people have been able to say, well, we can't do a 20-year randomized control trial, so we don't really know whether it's having a long-term beneficial effect, actually the studies now are very sophisticated in terms of statistical control and the power of these observational designs. And actually the effects look very, slight euphemism, quite subtle, let's say, subtle long-term effects that are very hard to tease out apart from other factors. So yeah, so there's that limitation. Side effects, we know about side effects, weight-related, sleep-related, height-related side effects, for instance. but relatively easy to manage and control in the longer term with good clinical care. Serious side effects do exist, but they're very, very rare, and of course should be monitored carefully. I mean, these the treatments are stimulants. They have effects on the heart, for instance. And of course, the whole issue of acceptance. A lot of kids. Actually, I was at a meeting on Tuesday, and there was a man who'd had ADHD all his life. He's 60, had a very exciting life, I have to say. And he just was offered medication about 2 years ago. He was diagnosed 2 years ago. And he described it as basically, because he'd taken a lot of drugs over his life, he described it as a very frustrating form of cocaine, because you never, ever get the rush, the buzz. You just get a sense of heightened attention, which is, of course, what's the clinical purpose. But he couldn't stand it. He said, no, it made me feel awful, because he was expecting that, because he's a drug user, he was expecting it to go to the next step. So I thought it was very interesting. So some people just don't like it. Some clinicians don't think it's ethical, for instance. And some countries there are countries that, I don't know what the situation is in Greece, but there are countries where where the range of medications is rather limited. So they're not particularly strong. So there's all these reasons, to think about, what about non-pharmacological treatments? How can we, so are non-pharmacological treatments a realistic alternative to pharmacological treatments? Well, let's take an example of parent training is one that's often recommended in guidelines. Now, parent training is great for lots of things. Of course it is, but it's not good for controlling ADHD symptoms. So we really need to develop some new and effective non-pharmacological treatments. That's our translational imperative in our field, I think. That's the most important thing. And so a translational approach is basically a science-driven approach. So you identify the causes or the mediating processes so you can target them more effectively with your treatments. So that's what we kind of have been trying to do for the last 30 to 40 years, I suppose. And the question is it successful? So from the medical model's perspective, what is the translational logic from that medical model approach? Well, it starts out with the notion of that ADHD is underpinned by brain dysfunction, that creates disorder, ADHD, that leads to impairment in various settings and situations, high-demand situations. So that's the way I like to conceptualize the translational logic of the medical model. And of course, in terms of treatment, the goal is to fix the dysfunction, to reduce the disorder, and to resolve the impairment. And it looks a bit like that. So those are two treatments. I don't know what they are, it doesn't matter. Just the logic: improve brain function, reduce ADHD, which then leads to resolution of impairment. So that's the kind of logic we've all been working to. And that's what's driven our science. So you can see where the focus will be scientifically there. But what about approaches that have targeted the brain? Because that's clearly where we should be looking from the traditional medical model point of view. What have they shown? So we've got two neurotherapeutic approaches that have been tried extensively with ADHD, and we've reviewed both of them in the last 2 years in the European ADHD Guidelines Group. One of the papers just coming out in JAMA Psychiatry. The other one was in, what was this one in? I can't remember, doesn't matter. So there's cognitive training, and this is, of course, the idea of strengthening certain brain networks through sort of adaptive training on computerized tasks. So the most famous one is working memory training. So building up working memory and strengthening those associated brain networks, frontoparietal networks, for instance, frontostriatal networks, through this training. And then the other one, of course, is neurofeedback. There's quite a lot of research into neurofeedback in ADHD. Again, it's kind of translational. It's built on scientific understanding. And that really is about helping people to regulate their brain activity by visualizing it and then reinforcing it through the contingency with that visualization. The only problem is that neither of them work. So there's, these are the two meta-analyses. We've just got quite a lot of trials you can see already in these two areas. And you can see that the effect sizes, so these are the classical plots. So basically, anything that cuts that line is not significantly beneficial statistically. So you can see the effect size are tiny for cognitive training and probably more heterogeneous, but still pretty tiny for neurofeedback. So I think our conclusion was that we're not in a position, based on the evidence, to support the use of either of these as frontline treatments for ADHD. Obviously very controversial, because as you can see, a lot of people have invested a lot of their careers in these two things. So we weren't aiming to make friends with this. We were aiming to help clinicians and parents make decisions. It doesn't mean it won't work for some people, of course, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have other advantages, which I won't have time to go into. But not surprisingly, for instance, working memory training does improve working memory. It just doesn't reduce ADHD symptoms. Okay. So now, why is this the case? Why aren't these working? And is it because we've not made any scientific progress? And there is a paradox at the heart, I think anyway, at the heart of what we've done. And that is that how is it that we are further away from our destination, which will perform translatable science, develop new interventions? How are we further away from that goal than we were when we started the journey? That's kind of quite hard to understand. And of course, it's because of the science, because we've understood now how complex and heterogeneous ADHD actually is. That the path, the goal is the same, but the path is much longer and much more circuitous to get us to this goal. That's what's happened. So it does feel like, I'm not saying, I wouldn't like to say I wasted 35 years, but it does feel like we're further away from finding out, actually, performing the science that will create those therapeutic opportunities. Why is that the case? What is blocking this therapeutic progress and this scientific, not scientific progress, but there's been a lot, but the translatable science progress? Do we need to look at ADHD in a different way? So let's get on to the science. We've done the first sort of criteria for paradigm shifting. What about the scientific credibility? So what are the assumptions that underpin the medical model? And you can look at them. You can read the DSM. It's actually got a definition of what it is. But there are some commonly held assumptions amongst scientists. I think they are being challenged. I mean, I've been challenging them for a long time, but I think they are very much challenged. So I'm not trying to set up a straw man here, but just to illustrate the sorts of shifts in the field that we've seen. So some of the assumptions: ADHD is a natural category with natural boundaries between normality and abnormality or disorder, and between different disorders. So it's a categorical entity. Obviously, the challenge to that is the notion of dimensionality, that ADHD is actually a dimension, and that there's a lot of overlap or transdiagnostic overlap. The second assumption is this notion that at the heart of it, the core, is this neurocognitive dysfunction. The challenge to that is the core role for motivation that I'm going to talk about. And the third one is that it's a single thing. It's a singular thing. It's a singular biological or neurobiological or neurocognitive thing. And the challenge to that is what I call deep heterogeneity. In fact, it's incredibly heterogeneous at all levels of explanation, and not just at symptom. We know symptoms, it's heterogeneous, but going down through the levels of causal explanation to the brain, to genes, in fact, and to environments. So deeply heterogeneous, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The final one, which I'm not going to talk about, is the assumption that it's congenital, appears very, very early in life, and that it's neurodevelopmental, that it unfolds across time. Katerina very kindly mentioned the English-Romanian adoptee study, which I was leading for about 15 years, and this is one of our focuses. That's not right, is it? Foci. And we have explored the role of postnatal deprivation as a causal factor in driving ADHD, and it seems we can't it seems that that's the most plausible explanation for what we see in those adopted kids from the Romanian orphanages. Anyway, where are we? Challenge 1. How am I doing for time? Don't tell me 10 minutes, please. Half an hour? Oh, well, 25 minutes. 30 minutes. Okay, how 35 minutes? Is ADHD a dimension? Okay, that's the first challenge. So how do we find that out? It sounds yeah, it's obvious. So we've done lots of thinking about this with a colleague of mine, Dave Coghill. We wrote something you might be interested. Way back, 12 years ago now, seems just yesterday, which is in the very wonderful Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. And it goes through the evidence for ADHD and other conditions about whether they are truly categorical or dimensional. So if you look at these people, obviously within any community, and it actually could be a picture of this room, of course. So there are probably people with ADHD, some with more severe expressions, some with clinical, subclinical manifestation, of course, of varying degrees, and some with no traits at all. Now, on the face of it, just by looking at that variation in this room, there is obviously a continuum at one level of ADHD. There are some, there are more or less extreme expressions. But that doesn't really answer the question, because the notion that ADHD is a natural category, I mean, this is self-evident. Everybody, you don't have to study this, it's just self-evident, is that this continuum hides a natural category. So the question is, how do you find that natural category in a continuous set of data? And so, of course, the person we have to turn to is this wonderful man. I don't know if he was a wonderful man, he might be a horrible man, actually, but he was a brilliant scientist, a brilliant philosopher, and pretty much a genius, called Paul Meehl. Some of you will know Paul Meehl. And I call him the taxon hunter, or the category hunter. So he developed a whole way of finding of statistical approaches to find out, is there a category underpinning this continuum? So he argued the only rational basis for inferring the existence of a taxonic entity must lie within the pattern displayed by it's a bit of a mouthful, by the pattern displayed by the presumed indicators of the conjectured taxon. So you have to look to the latent aspects of the taxon and look at what the relationship is between the symptom severity expression and the underlying causes statistically. And just to give you an example, so essentially the way I understand that is that what we're looking for in the data is a step change in the relationship between the underlying causes and the ADHD symptoms as you increase the severity of ADHD. And at that point, there's your natural boundary, if there is a step change. And I've got a picture just to help, because I know it's rather abstract and difficult to get your head around. So for instance, here's a nice J-shape, well, kind of like a J-shaped distribution, typical of a symptom checklist. And you've got the percentage of affected individuals, and you've got severity of ADHD along there. And you can see there's a little hump there. That looks interesting. Maybe that's evidence that there's a category, a qualitatively different group of people who have this category called ADHD. And then if that's the case, then you think, oh, that might be the threshold. But of course, that's not sufficient evidence to show a category. What Paul Meehl argued was that you take another indicator, say, I don't know, frontal lobe activity, I don't know, and it could be anything. And then you say, deficits in frontal lobe activity, this orange line, what he would say, if there's a category, is you'd see a general linear increase of that, perhaps, over time as a symptom severity. But as soon as you hit your natural boundary, the association increases massively. So there's that discontinuity in that association. So it's about the association. But very quickly, given time, the answer is, what is the answer? So he did all this taxometric stuff. He wrote a whole load of statistical programs. And essentially, without getting into too much detail, there is not one study that suggests that they see that step change in that association. And there's been a lot of studies of ADHD. There's no evidence that ADHD is a natural category. Okay, I'm moving on because I realized I've only got 35 minutes. Okay, so second question. So if it's not about the biology of ADHD, where would you draw the cutoff? Because there's no natural category to help you. You have to come up with a cutoff to say this person needs treatment. So I did a study with my another brilliant PhD student of mine, Trine from Aarhus, and she did a study looking at impairment as a possible indicator of where you should draw the line. So she was saying, well, I wonder if the relationship between ADHD symptom severity and impairment level is linear, so no real cutoff, or shows this curvilinear effect, suggesting, for instance, there might be a natural threshold here where we could draw the clinical cutoff. Unfortunately, her data suggests there is no such thing. The relationship is completely linear. There's no point at which we could say, yeah, that's where we should draw the cutoff. So, okay, so it looks arbitrary to some degree and is going to be, but is it random or is it lawful? So this is another brilliant PhD student of mine, just graduated, Wendy Chan. And she looked at this in the context of comparing ADHD thresholds in the UK and in Hong Kong, China, on the assumption that if we're going to find differences in thresholds, these are two cultures where we might see them because of different attitudes to behavior, different parenting norms, and so forth. And so she looked at this by getting parents to rate ADHD, just standard symptom rating scales, and then actually measure the activity of the kids in various situations. And what she found was, so the red is the UK, and the green is the Hong Kong. So you can see that across all levels of severity of ADHD, this is actually hyperkinetic, this is the hyperactivity subscale, you see the ADHD score higher. And that's really important, because if you take the 80th centile of the ratings from the UK, and you take them across the activity, then you go back, take them to the Hong Kong line, you see that people who are at the 80th centile in the UK are actually the 93rd centile in Hong Kong. I think it's rather neat, that little graph, actually. 93rd centile in Hong Kong. So clearly a completely different threshold in judging who should be described as having a symptom or a constellation of symptoms. So really, really, so yeah. So challenge one, ADHD is a dimension, and the drawing of clinical thresholds appears arbitrary to some degree. They say it's a clinical judgment, which is another way of saying it's kind of arbitrary to some degree, I guess. But it's not random. It varies systematically by things like culture. So fascinating set of data. But, you know, I mean, that first assumption that it's a category, and it's a fundamental one, because the whole of the diagnostic system is categorical, it doesn't hold water. All this stuff challenges the underlying assumptions of ADHD. Is it time for a Kuhnian paradigm shift in ADHD? Based on that, well, think about it. So what about motivation? So, of course, this is the old medical model I've represented. I'd be very interested in feedback, whether that helps people understand what I'm talking about, because it's a different way of representing it, and it helps me, but it might not help other people. So the question is, what is that underlying brain dysfunction? Of course, this very famous gentleman, many of you will have heard him speak, is Russell Barkley. He had a very strident theory, which he promoted throughout his career with great skill. And that's basically that at the core are deficits in inhibitory control. That is the brain cognitive dysfunction. And that is, did I show a picture of a brain? I did, sorry, yeah. Frontostriatal dysfunction leads to deficit in inhibitory control, leads to a whole range of executive function. That's his basic model. And so problems with working memory, impaired switching, et cetera, all due to this underlying impairment in inhibitory control linked to this altered brain system. So that's Russell's sort of model. And there's loads of evidence to support an association between ADHD and difficulties in executive control. But his theory went further than that. In his mind, it was a necessary and a sufficient condition for ADHD, which is a major claim if you think about it. But that was the model. Is that the case? Well, we'll see as we go on if I can get to it. So lots of evidence of an association. But the effect sizes are relatively moderate, 0.4, 0.5. You know, nothing that would suggest there's a kind of there's a unanimity between executive function, dysfunction, and ADHD. So could we look at it in a different way? So I've talked about paradigm shifts, and in Kuhn's idea, you basically, progress is you go from one paradigm to the next paradigm to the next paradigm. But I wrote an editorial the other day, what I call paradigm flipping. And that is more tactical. It's like a scientific tactic to try and just look at the phenomena in a different way on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and then in a different way on Mondays and whatever the other day was, I didn't say, Wednesdays. Yeah, so you're flipping between paradigms. And of course, as human beings, we're great at this. So this is, everybody knows this one. If you don't, I think everybody knows it, Katerina, don't they? But of course, you can do it for this picture, the old lady with the big nose or the young lady with the small nose. You can do it with ADHD. Is it a dysfunction or is it a function? So we have, for a long time, been exploring the possibilities when you think about ADHD as functional rather than dysfunctional. And so dysfunction, ADHD symptoms reflect a dysfunction in executive control. So we introduce an alternative, kind of like an economic view. I did behavioral economics for my PhD, so it clearly had a big impact on my thinking. So symptoms are functional or rational expressions of different goals held by different people. And goals in economics is translated into maximand. What are you trying to maximize with your behavior? So that's what I was thinking when I flipped this paradigm in this way. And what we argued was, we came up with a kind of crazy hypothesis that actually what people with ADHD are trying to do is minimize waiting. And that all the symptoms lead to minimization of waiting, and that's why they do them. And nothing to do with the fact they can't inhibit, or they can't, actually just trying to minimize the horrible experience of waiting. So this is the sort of figure of the model. Delay minimization, so that's the goal, that's your economic goal as a person with ADHD. In the hypothesis at this stage. So if you can escape delay, well, what do you do? Obviously, the thing you do is choose the most immediate thing, if you can escape delay. And that's called impulsive choice. And it looks like impulsiveness, clinically. What can you do if you can't escape delay? Anybody got an idea? Anyway, well, you probably read it, so you might know. But what you can do if you can't escape delay, oh, sorry, that's impulsive choice. Yeah, sorry, I'll get through that. Well, if you can't escape delay, what do you do? Well, what you do is you act in a way that changes how delay feels. And you reduce the aversiveness of it by speeding up the passage of time. And we know from lots of experiments that activity, excess activity, fidgeting, shifting your attention to interesting stuff, that's why everybody's looking at the walls rather than at the talk, or disrupting the room, which ADHD kids are really good at school, you know, will change the way time feels. We know that. And a lot of people thought, that's ridiculous, Ed. I said, no, because we know, I just like to put this up, we know that time is a very malleable thing. And we know, of course, I don't know if you have the same in Greek, but time flies when you're having fun. Watch pot never boils. Yeah. I mean, it's like folk psychology, really, at the core of the theory. So, oh yeah, sorry. So people with ADHD behave like they're actually trying to reduce delay. So for instance, on long delay, on tasks with long delays, there's a lot more activity, a lot more inattention. What's the point of that? Yeah, that delay-related inattention is very highly correlated with people's statements about how much they dislike delay. So they say, oh, I hate waiting. And all their activity in the setting is very highly correlated with that motivational statement. So lots of interesting evidence, but the best evidence probably comes from an imaging study we did. We got round to it eventually after all these years. We did a few actually, but this is by far the best one, I think. This is by another brilliant PhD student of mine. I've been so blessed with brilliant PhD students. And this is Jeroen van Dessel from Leuven, where I worked for a little bit. And he basically asked the question is, what does the ADHD brain do when delay is impending? How does it react? And we can kind of predict how it should react, because we know that, for instance, people who are anxious react to certain cues within certain brain regions. The limbic system is activated when people face aversive stimuli. So our prediction was that the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, but also some frontal aspects of the system and so forth, would be hyperactivated when people are expecting delay. ADHD people are expecting delay. 10. Oh, great. That's more than I thought you were going to give me, so that's great. You can see I haven't got a very good way of judging delay. But so in the imaging setup, it's a neat thing. It's based on the monetary incentive delay task, some of you may know. Very clever brain imaging task looking at the power of incentives to shape brain function. We had this rather neat design. So we had a cue was presented in the scanner. Then there was a target. They had to respond to the target. Then they got feedback if they responded within a certain time or not, depending on the condition. And then they either had to wait or not wait. And in this condition, for instance, they had to wait for either 2, 6, or 14 seconds. And that doesn't sound a lot, but 14 seconds is a long time. Well, I find it a very long time anyway. And so in a scanner as well. So that's the certain delay condition. So we're interested in saying, what's the brain response to that when they know this is the consequence? Whatever they do, they can't, it doesn't matter how well they perform, they're always going to get 14 seconds, for instance. The other condition, we had 3 conditions. I'll talk about 2 of them. The other one is no delay. So no matter how badly or well you did, you never had to wait. So the blue is like, wow, thank gosh for that. Thank gosh for that. I don't have to wait, even no matter how badly I do. So what did we find? And of course, we do a subtraction. We take the activity to one cue from another cue, and then ADHD from controls. And what we found was exactly what we predicted, which is not very common, I have to say, in the world of science. So it was a wonderful revelation of the findings. So across all these core sort of limbic regions, anterior insular, temporal pole, amygdala, dorsolateral and ventromedial prefrontal cortexes, we found higher activation to the certain delay cues in the ADHD group, whereas the control group, which was, as I say, a strong confirmation of the aversive power of delay to be with ADHD. Oh yeah, just to say that we ran the same thing with monetary loss. And we think, oh, everybody hates monetary loss. Everybody does hate monetary loss. ADHD, people with ADHD hate monetary loss. People without ADHD hate monetary loss. But we don't see these specific effects for ADHD at all. So it's really quite specific to delay, which was quite an extraordinary finding. So the second challenge, motivational factors, especially delay, play a key role in ADHD. And it's not all about executive deficits related to frontotemporal, frontostriatal, dorsal frontostriatal networks or whatever. The third one, which is the only one I'll be able to get to, I think, in the time, but it's still a very interesting one. Is it a single thing? Because, you know, Russ Barkley argued that it is executive dysfunction. That is it. And then we have been doing research looking at this, what we call deep heterogeneity. And that's not clinical heterogeneity, which we know is very common, but going down into the different explanatory levels, down to the brain, down to the genes. And we argued that that heterogeneity promotes an alternative model, really, for the whole of child psychiatry, actually, but certainly ADHD. So I won't go through that. But the first paper we did that made us think about this idea was this with my colleagues in NYU, another place where I'm like a gypsy, another place where I've spent a few years working with these wonderful people. Paper by Mary Salanto is the first author. And they came to me because nobody believed in delay aversion at the time. Nobody. They thought it was mad. And it probably was in some ways. But they said, well, what we'll do, Ed, we'll test it against the executive dysfunction model. We'll get you get your best test, and we'll ask Russell Shaka to get his best test. He was an inhibitory control. And then we'll put them together and we'll see which is right. So we thought, oh, we're going to get an answer. What's right? So we both had, I did my little choice task thing, and they did their little executive function thing. And we thought, yeah, we're going to find out who's right. Head-to-head, very powerful design. Unfortunately, well, fortunately, really, because it was a major step forward, we were actually both right. So ADHD was correlated with delay aversion and executive deficits in the group. But at the same time, both of those, so it was uncorrelated in the group, but both of those were correlated with ADHD symptoms. And this led us to this, what we called a dual pathway model, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. Dual pathway model of ADHD. So we've got the old executive function pathway. That was the one Russell promoted. And then we've got this other pathway. And they both lead to ADHD. And this is the delay-related motivational pathway. It was published in 2002, 22 years ago now. And I think eventually had a transformative effect on the field. And of course, those two pathways are linked to two brain circuits, both frontostriatal, one more dorsal, the executive, one more ventral, the motivational. And then after that, we thought, well, this is, perhaps there's more heterogeneity than just these two pathways. So we looked at timing, and we found a third independent set of cognitive functions related to the cerebellum and the frontocerebellum loops and so forth that were related to timing. So what's the implication of that? Well, the implication of that is kind of this. So when you looked at it in terms of groupings, what you found was there were separate groups within the ADHD community, some who had delay aversion, and some who had executive dysfunction, and some who had both. Now, there's big implications, of course, with treatment there. If our translational goal is to target the relevant underlying problem, if you treat somebody who's got delay aversion with executive training, well, big surprise, it doesn't work. And then, following this paper, lots of other papers adopted a very similar approach, and all of them showed these distinct neuropsychological subtypes within ADHD. Now, quite clearly, in terms of the third challenge, that also goes against this notion of a singular biological entity. Yeah, so I will actually stop there, if that's okay, because I was going to go on to neurodiversity, but maybe that's next time I come, I can talk about neurodiversity. Or we can talk about it outside. So overall, and I'm just laying out where we've got to in the field. We've got a conundrum. And the conundrum is, we have a categorical diagnostic system, which seems to be getting treatment to the right people, and seems to be a basis for clinical decision-making. And that's, of course, because as human beings, we are categorizers. And when we've got a complex clinical space, we have a heuristic, which is categorical and trait-based. So it's kind of an automatic medical model in our heads. The problem is it doesn't fit with the science at all. So I'll leave you with the question, what do we do as a field? We have something that works clinically, doesn't relate to the science, and we want to do science-driven research, translational research. Where do we go? Do we throw overboard all the benefits of the diagnostic clinical model and go with a more science-driven model? And when do we do that? Because I don't think the time's right yet. We haven't got enough information about what dimensions or so forth, a more dimensional system. Or do we just say, well, we can't do science-driven therapeutic translational work anymore because we can't translate back to this category. So I mean, from an intellectual point of view, it's a fascinating, and also a philosophical point of view, it's a fascinating conundrum. And I don't know actually what the answer is. I suppose we could have a hybrid system where you both have the categories and you identify some underlying dimensions and kind of bring those together with a diagnostic manual, so the science can proceed and the categorical clinical approach can proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edmund, for this inspirational and mind-changing presentation, at least for me. I'm sure that everyone has found it really, really interesting. So I will steal 5 minutes from the break if there are any questions that you would like to ask.
Yeah, he was smiling all the way through, so it could be a good joke.
First off, I would like to say it was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I'm not actually a student of psychology, I'm a student of medicine, which is, I think, relevant in this case.
Very relevant, yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering for one, if maybe it is possible to reverse engineer the clinical significance of stimulants, so to speak. So you would test through their use what makes them work and on which part exactly of the ADHD spectrum they function the most.
So I couldn't quite hear that, sorry.
I'm saying if there is a way to maybe reverse engineer what makes the stimulant affect ADHD or certain types of it thereof.
Oh, I see. So when you say reverse engineer, do you mean like pharmacology?
Through imaging trials, for example. Yeah, if we can see.
Yeah, well, that is the goal. I mean, that is the goal, to identify those neural substrates and their pharmacological agents that we know are likely to impact those substrates. And so people have tried that, but we really haven't come up with any new molecules either, never mind non-pharmacological treatments. So I remember being on an advisory board with AstraZeneca with nicotine receptor ADHD as a possible, which I like because with my cigars, yeah. But that didn't go anywhere. So there's a lot of approaches to that kind of rational approach, translation approach, but it really hasn't borne any fruit. I mean, as you know, we only found out really about the power of stimulants to change behavior just by absolute chance and intuition by psychiatrists in the 40s and the 50s in America. So in a way, it's like reverse translational science. We've learned more about the causes of ADHD from the effects of medication than we've developed new medications based on the causes of ADHD. So it's it's worse than neutral.
Oh, so it's not even empirical, it was like directly influencing our understanding of it after we administered the treatment.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's a lot of what they call pharmacoimaging, looking at exactly those. Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
or am I getting missing?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
So, okay, there's a lot of pharmacoimaging. And so we do know, for instance, that the effects of stimulant medication, methylphenidate, on executive functions, for instance, is about half the effect it has on symptoms, which is kind of interesting. And maybe that's because other brain systems are involved, serotonergic systems or whatever. So yeah, it could be interesting. Thank you. I hope I answered your question. Sorry.
Yeah, it was.
Is there any other question?
Got one in the front?
Yes. Here, please.
Hello, thanks for this very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for this very interesting talk. I was wondering, from a biocultural perspective, is there any cross-cultural data already there to maybe indicate any cultural effects on these motivating factors that are assumed to underlie, especially delay, or are assumed to underlie the heterogeneity that you are referring to?
Were you planted in the audience for that question? Is that your word? So yeah,
that's a very interesting perspective, this integrated perspective.
So in the model, when we initially formulated it, I think it's in biological psychiatry or something, we kind of did an extension where we looked at the underlying causes. And so we had this notion that, in fact, delay aversion is the product of the interplay between the cultural setting and the constraints and values of the cultural setting, mediated by parenting behavior, teachers' behavior.
Practices.
Yeah, their practices, creating this aversive. So if you've got basically difficulties inhibiting, if that's the underlying, the core, and then you're placed in a situation where there's loads of delay, a lot of people are going to get angry with you. I won't say I know, I can speak from personal experience, but and that creates a negative reinforcing cycle, or negatively reinforcing cycle, creating an aversion to delay. So that was explicit in the model when it was first put out. We never tested it till this year. So Wendy, the PhD student I showed you with the nice threshold differences, she did a study in Hong Kong and the UK on exactly this point. So we got parents to interact with their kids in a frustrating delay situation. So we measured not only the kids' behavior into the delay, we measured the parents' response to the kids. So we looked at how upset, agitated, angry the parents got. And then we thought, well, we can test our hypothesis by looking whether the parents' reaction predict an increase in delay aversion and, of course, in ADHD. And it did. How about that?
Yeah. So maybe this is the direction to head.
I think it's I wish I'd done more. I wish I'd got to that quicker in my career, actually. But the paper should be coming out, actually. We've got to just put in a revision. I mean, it's a very controversial thing because most people would say proximal, social, familial influences won't influence the course of ADHD. Most people would say that, particularly in the field, because there's a biogenetic disorder, blah, 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 blah. So this is quite controversial, but we got through the first round of referees' comments, so that's good.
And you have coevolution theory, so you have biological coevolution to support all this. Yeah. There's already evidence on that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. What we did was, of course, look at parental ADHD as well. And we also looked at the parents' behavior in a non-delay situation. And that didn't predict increase in delay aversion. I mean, to be honest, wasn't perfect because the design should have had another aversive non-delay condition, like a really difficult task or something. But what it was tidy the toys up and free play. So it's not the perfect control, but it's a start. And we didn't see those effects. It was only for the responses during the delay, which I thought was very encouraging, very interesting. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't allow any other questions inside the room, but I'm sure Edmund will be happy to answer questions outside. Yeah. So we can move out of the room, and you can ask him whatever you would like. No. Okay, within reason. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. And Edmund, this is a little thank you.